Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's 7 p.m. here in Manila, Philippines, 7 a.m. in the East Coast of US. Hello, Judy, good morning to you. And somewhere in between in Central and West Asian countries and in Europe also. Welcome to our knowledge sharing event, COVID-19 vaccine. Are Central and West Asian countries ready? This is a joint event by Asian Development Bank together with the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. I'm Laziza Sabirova, Principal Regional Economist at ADB Central and West Asia Regional Department. And our department covers 10 countries, 5 Central Asian countries, 3 South Caucasus, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. Together with me, moderating this session today is a friend and good colleague, Nargis Kasyanova, Senior Fellow at the Central Asian Program at Davis Center at Harvard. So all our countries in our region are struggling with the pandemic, which of course affected many lives, many families, and wreaked havoc to our economies. While our countries are struggling and our governments are struggling with current battles, it's also very important to have a forward-looking thinking and forward-looking policy making. And of course, the game changer in all that is the development and access to an effective and safe vaccine against COVID-19. So today we invited 2 experts to talk about the vaccine development, how our countries in our region can access this vaccine, and importantly, what issues should be on the to-do list agenda of our governments. So let me introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Patrick Oseva. He is our Chief of Health Sector Group at the Asian Development Bank. And Patrick leads policy, technical and operational, all sorts of operational matters on the new emerging issues in health sector and health area in the Asia and the Pacific. We also have Professor Judy Twigg. She's a professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, and she's teaching courses in global health, in international political economy. And she's also associated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and also the Eurasia Foundation. So we thought that there will not be presentations for this event. This will be we will like it to be a truly interactive and really genuinely knowledge sharing event. So Nargis and I will have few questions and we will pose them to our experts, Judith and Patrick. And we will also have a Q&A session. So all of you who joined, I see here people are still joining, and we have quite a good number of audience today. Please submit your questions in the chat box. So we as moderators will monitor these questions, and please vote for questions that you like so that we see what questions are popular. And we also have a few questions submitted by people when they register for this event. So the topic is so complex and there are myriads of related issues. So obviously it will not be possible to cover everything related to COVID vaccine. So today we decided to have sort of like a vaccine one-on-one session, just to have a big picture. What is the current situation with vaccine development? What are the mechanisms through which our countries in Central and West Asia can access and finance this vaccine? And in general, what are the things that should be on the agenda of our countries, our government? So this is the focus of today's session. There are no doubt many more important issues in this area, such as, for example, global and regional cooperation, intellectual property rights, and so on. But I think this session today will not be looking at this. Perhaps for future events, we can consider them also. And before we really start our discussion, let me just have one more note. We will record this session and we will make a Russian translation of this video recording later for further dissemination. And also, as I said, this is the first sort of knowledge sharing event in this series on COVID-related events. I'm pretty sure we will have more sessions of this sort on COVID vaccine, but also on other COVID-related issues. For example, one idea in our list is experience of Asian countries in tracing, in contact tracing for Central Asia and South Caucasus and Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, so stay tuned for our subsequent events. And with this, let me start the discussion, really. And Patrick, I think first question will go to you. So we hear, of course, that nowadays there are more than 165 vaccines in development stage, and some of them already in human trial stage. So could you please tell us kind of big picture? Could you tell us about what's going on in this global race for vaccine development? Please, Patrick.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here today to share experience and to engage in a conversation around vaccines, because as we look at COVID, the pandemic has been going on for almost 6 months now, and we do not see it ending, because when we think that it's going down, then there's another flare. In Australia now, for example, a country that had controlled COVID so well, and they were beginning to think about a travel bubble between New Zealand and Australia. Now there's a big crisis in one of the states, the state of Victoria, where the capital city of that state is Melbourne. And right now there's complete shutdown, the worst shutdown they've had in more than 100 years. So it just shows that we don't know how this virus is going to look like. Therefore, we need a vaccine. But to be able to get a vaccine is a process that takes a while. And so the big picture of what's happening is that there are more than 165 vaccines that are under trial. Of those, about 36 of them are in the clinical trial. So vaccine has two parts. There's a preclinical, which the vaccine is still being tried in animals, in mice, and so on. And then after that, when it's perceived to be safe enough, then we start testing in humans. So there are 36 vaccines that are being tested in a clinical setting. Of those, 17 are on phase 1. Phase 1 is whereby we have very few people, sometimes just about 20 people also, and we are trying to see if the vaccine is safe. The most important aspect of that is safety of vaccine. So you want to see if the vaccine is safe, because if it's not safe, you cannot proceed. Is the vaccine safe in a small controlled trial? Then if it's safe enough, then you go to a slightly larger number of people, perhaps about 100, 120, and now you look at if the vaccine is effective. So the first stage is safety. Is it safe enough for human beings? The second stage, if it's determined to be safe, then you want to see, is it effective? Does it stimulate your body to produce an immune response? Now, if it is proved to be effective, but then that the numbers are still fairly small, then you have to do it in a larger scale. And this could be thousands of people. This is phase 3, whereby now it's done in a larger group of people. Some of the vaccines right now are being done in 20,000 people. So you then monitor how is it performing in a larger group of people, different some are young, some are middle-aged, some are older. Then you see how it performs. If it's effective and safe, then you can now start administering that vaccine to people. That whole process for many, many years took a very long time. It took years. But for COVID vaccine, the agenda is very aggressive, and they want to do this in a short period of time. In discussion with WHO today, they said that they think that the first vaccine might be available, and I repeat, might be available, not will, but might be available in April next year. And then the second and the third might be available, again, might be available in October next year. So if you look at the big picture and when vaccines might be available, we are talking about the first quarter of next year and the last quarter of next year. By the way, that is just when it's available. That has not been available to you. That is when the companies say they have proof that the vaccine is good. Now, the next stage after that is, how do you produce the vaccine in enough volume to make it available at a country level? That is the most complicated part, because what that means, today in the world we have 8 billion people. And if everybody has to get a vaccine, and to date, most of the vaccines that are under trial requires 2 dosages. So it means that you need to produce 16 billion dosages. But it's not just the dosages that you need to produce. You need to produce glass vials. You have to put the vaccine in a vial. You need syringes. You need needles. It's a mammoth undertaking. Let's stop there.
Yeah. Nargis, maybe.
Thank you very much, Patrick. My question is to Judy. Judy, you are an expert on Russian health sector, and I want to ask you about the Russian vaccine. Patrick just mentioned that the vaccines might be available in the first quarter next year, the last quarter next year, and we're not talking about the mass production. But Russia just announced that they have the first vaccine ready, developed by the Gamaleya Institute, and they might start the mass vaccination in October already. And we also have the Vector Center that is also practically ready with their vaccine. So what is going on, Judy? Can you share your thoughts on the Russian vaccine with us?
Thank you for this question, and thanks very much for the opportunity to contribute to this conversation this morning. Russia has a very strong history of successful vaccine development dating back to the Soviet period. The Soviet Union collaborated with the United States on development of the polio vaccine back in the 1950s. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Soviet Union donated more smallpox vaccine to the World Health Organization than all other countries combined in the successful effort to eradicate smallpox. The Soviet Union developed the freeze-drying process that enabled the delivery of the smallpox vaccine to harsh environments. So there's a history of good, respected science in the area of vaccines coming out of the Soviet Union and now out of Russia. The current conversation about the accelerated development of a vaccine in Russia centers around 2 candidates. One from the Gamaleya Institute, which is part of the Russian Ministry of Health. They've already done some trials on military personnel. And the other at the Vector Research Center, which is part of Rospotrebnadzor, their consumer affairs regulatory agency. Both, as Patrick indicated, are 2-dose products. They have to be administered 21 days apart. The Gamaleya product is reported to be about a month ahead of the Vector product, both well through phase 1 and 2 trials. And so the big announcement that Russia has made in the last week or so is that it is about, over the next month to 6 weeks, to begin mass vaccination of healthcare workers and teachers. And it's not clear exactly what they have in mind here for how this activity relates to the traditional timeline of vaccine development. Is this essentially the equivalent of a compressed phase 3? It's not clear. There are questions. It's not clear whether or not this mass vaccination that they're about to begin will cover, as Patrick indicated, both the young and the old, the sick and the healthy. Will there be a full coverage of the population so that we get the data that we need from the study? Will some patients get placebos? What are the procedures for follow-up of the people who receive this vaccine, surveillance? Exactly what Russia is doing and what they have in mind isn't clear at this point. And right now, there is no Russian phase 3 clinical trial on the WHO list of clinical trials. Russia is right now saying that it can produce in Russia about 30 million doses of vaccine in this calendar year, in 2020, and about another 170 million doses abroad. With serial production beginning in September, they say they've discussed production arrangements with about 20 other countries, including India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia. The head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, which has financed some of this vaccine development, says that they're in advanced talks with countries across South America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia to transfer the technology for eventual production. Now, there's no history of innovative drugs or vaccines developed in Russia getting regulatory approval in the United States, Europe, or Japan. Russia has a track record of the type of vaccine that is being developed at the Gamaleya laboratory. It uses the same vaccine technology as Russia's Ebola vaccine. And they say that this is why they've been able to move so fast on this similar COVID vaccine. Essentially, Russia is looking for a Sputnik moment here, and they're using that terminology, a Sputnik moment. It would be a huge scientific and geopolitical coup for Russia to be first out of the gate here, but clearly they are lowering the standard regulatory hurdles in order to make that happen. I should also mention that there is also talk of vaccine development in Kazakhstan. The Research Committee on Biosafety Issues of the Science Committee of the Ministry of Education and Science has a vaccine registered with WHO. It's currently in preclinical animal trials, including on primates. So I think that's important to note. I'll stop right there.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Judith. Well, as economists, we always look at issues sort of from supply and demand side, and I think we can apply this this thinking also to vaccine development. So I think the next question maybe goes to Patrick, actually. We have heard about this COVAX facility, which will make vaccines available to low and middle income countries. So Patrick, maybe you can tell us about this facility, how our countries in Central and West Asia will be able to, or maybe some of them are already accessing this facility. And maybe later we can also talk about the financing aspect of that.
Okay, can I see the second slide, please? Second slide, please.
Mm-hmm.
So what the global community has done is that if you look at where we come from in COVID-19, in March, the late February and March, there was a serious problem in terms of getting personal protective equipment. There was competition. The countries were competing with each other. 60% of PPEs are produced in China. And because of the virus, the pandemic in China, production basically went down. But this is something that was required by health workers and by other population in other countries. And so the challenge was, how does a country get PPEs? So countries were competing with each other. Even some of the decentralized countries, you'd find that within a country, states or provinces were competing with each other and so on. It was a very chaotic situation. One lesson learned out of that is that if you want to have something that could be equity regarding how it's going to be achieved, there has to be some organized way to do it. So the global community has basically come together to see how they can coordinate vaccine trials, and at the same time assure that poor countries and rich countries will have access to those vaccines. So a facility has been created called COVAX, and this is a facility that has three members. The World Health Organization is there. The Gavi, the Vaccine Initiative, is coordinating it. And also there's a Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI. So basically, CEPI is raising money. The plan is to raise up to $2 billion. And then those $2 billion will be given to vaccine research, to a number of vaccines that are under trial. And if any of those vaccines are made available, then those vaccines will then be, they'll be for the poor countries, the low-income countries and low-middle-income countries. They will get it more or less for free. This will be subsidized vaccines for low-income countries and low-middle-income countries. For middle-income countries and upper-middle-income countries, they can be joined the COVAX. Right now, there are 92 countries that have joined. They can also join this COVAX facility, but then they will purchase the vaccine. Now, let me go to the next slide, please. So in Central West, there are several countries that are included as part of the facility that is subsidized. So you have Afghanistan, Kyrgyz Republic, Pakistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Those are countries that are included as countries, one of the 92, some of the 92 countries that will get subsidized vaccine. The ones that are not included, that would have to be self-financing, they'll have to pay for the vaccine, are Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, and Turkmenistan. So this is the issue. The COVAX is financing several vaccine candidates. Some of them will fail, some of them will succeed. The rich countries have contributed 500 million. They want to raise up to $2 billion. Any vaccine that succeeds, the poor countries will subsidize, the rich ones will buy. And because of significant demand, the first year, the vaccines will only be available for health workers and other vulnerable groups. The second year, or the second batch of vaccines, will be available to a slightly larger population, but up to 20% of the population. So just remember that the first batch of vaccine will be only for 3% of the population. The second batch will cover up to 20%. They have not said what happened to the 80% of the population. So if you look at if the vaccines that are available, first quarter you manufacture, then that will only be for 3% of the population. Perhaps the second batch will not cover up to 20% of the population. This will be the end of 2021. So for most countries to have significant number of people vaccinated, we are talking about 2022. Over.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So you covered the supply side, and I have a question about the demand side, and I want to ask Judy. Well, a successful vaccination campaign would require a lot of trust. So citizens would need to trust the government that the vaccine is safe, that it's effective, that it's very fairly distributed, which is an important issue, of course, as well. There is also a question of trust in vaccines in general. And well, we know that we see a proliferation of conspiracy theories about the virus, about the vaccine, and so on. What's your take on that? What the government should do, what maybe the societies should do, and if you can comment on the situation with trust and the demand side in our region.
Mm-hmm. So the key here is to convince people that the vaccine is safe and effective and being fairly distributed. So there are some key areas of messaging that governments need to think about in order to communicate these messages appropriately. One is whether or not the vaccine works. A successful vaccine will produce an immune response, but that doesn't mean that it will completely protect everyone against infection or disease. So we'll need more testing to know whether the immune response is protective and how extensive that protection is. And the levels of vaccine protection vary. 95% or higher for some vaccines. Our annual influenza vaccines are only 40 to 60% protective. We also need to know whether or not all people will be protected equally by a new vaccine. Protection of older people is likely to be less than that for younger people. How long will protection last? We don't know if it will last indefinitely or just for a couple of months or a couple of years. Also, overall, some vaccine candidates, as Patrick indicated, will be duds. Some may offer protection that decreases after just a few months. Some vaccines may work less well for less population groups. So we'll need to find answers to those questions as quickly as possible and communicate those answers effectively. The second question is whether or not the vaccine will be safe. There's a lot of innovation going on, obviously. Several candidate vaccines are using a harmless virus as a vector to deliver the antigen. That's a promising technology, but we have very limited experience using it. There are several vaccine candidates that are using DNA or RNA, which we've never used in humans before. The development of those DNA, RNA vaccines is faster than that for conventional vaccines. but there's so much that's new about this technology. So the important point here is that vaccines are overwhelmingly safe. Billions of doses of vaccine are given around the world every year and cause very few problems, but there are adverse effects from vaccination that may not show up until we've vaccinated hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. And again, we'll have to be very quick about discovering what those adverse reactions are and communicating candidly and clearly to people about those. And then finally, can we distribute the vaccine efficiently and fairly? Vaccine manufacturing isn't simple. Even with experienced pharmaceutical companies, there are failures, there will be contamination problems, and there are plenty of inexperienced companies making these new vaccines, companies without a track record of large-scale manufacturing. And then, as Patrick indicated, once the vaccine is produced, it has to be distributed quickly. It has to be stored and shipped at the right temperature. We have to educate physicians and the public, and we have to, as I said earlier, monitor the uptake and any harmful after effects. So asking how soon we'll have a vaccine is a very complicated question. There's not a single date. It's a more complicated issue than it seems on the surface. So the most important point in terms of making sure that we're on top of the demand side of things is good expectations management. We need to prevent an unrealistic belief that there will be some golden moment when a vaccine will end the pandemic. You know, we snap our fingers and we can return to normal life. A safe and effective vaccine is going to be the beginning, not the end of the last stage of this pandemic. There will be a gradual rollout of the vaccine that will likely take quite a long period of time. The first generation of vaccines may not be as good as subsequent generations of a COVID vaccine. It may offer less than full protection. The protection might not be long lasting. Regulators in the United States will approve a vaccine at a level of 50% effectiveness. That's the threshold for the Food and Drug Administration. That won't produce herd immunity. And so people will need to understand that even when there is an approved vaccine, they may still need to practice social distancing, mask wearing. These other measures may need to continue for quite some time. And we'll need to carefully explain all this to our publics. We need to build trust and confidence among public. Look at measles, for example. The measles vaccine is more than 90% effective, and yet still more than 140,000 children died of measles last year around the world because of localized low vaccination rates. So vaccine hesitancy and vaccine refusal are obviously huge issues. In the United States, surveys show that only about half of people plan to get a new COVID vaccine right away when it's released. In Russia, polls show that only about 16% of people will get the vaccine right away. 38% of Russians polled say they will never get a COVID-19 vaccine. But clearly there's huge vulnerability to disinformation about the safety of vaccines. We all know the stories, the misinformation, the falsehoods that are spread in the press and on social media about adverse events following vaccines. And there will be new information to feed into those disinformation streams as the COVID-19 vaccine is launched. You think back to 1955 and the vaccine for polio, Jonas Salk's vaccine. There was an incident then when one of the vaccine suppliers didn't fully inactivate the virus that was used in the shot. About 40,000 children were infected through the vaccination process. 51 children were paralyzed and 5 died in the United States. And yet remarkably back then, the communication about the vaccine and the level of trust in doctors and scientists was so high that people continued to have their children vaccinated anyway. Can you imagine what would happen today if we had that kind of mass adverse effect, that kind of mistake in the vaccination process? And that's possible. So we need strategies for building trust. We need to prepare people for the likelihood that there will be side effects to the vaccine and assure them that side effects are expected. They shouldn't worry. They shouldn't start rumor campaigns. They shouldn't run to their Facebook pages just because things like soreness at the injection site or fatigue or mild fever happen. The vaccine evaluation process has to be scientifically rigorous and it has to be open. We can't have lots of stories about vaccine makers making large profits, having large profit margins from the production and sale of the vaccines, especially since they've benefited from public funding for the research. And it's very important also to note that different vaccines will become available at different times. And some of the vaccines, again, are going to work better than others. Governments are going to have to set priorities for distribution of vaccines. Everybody says health workers should be at the top of the list. Good, that makes sense. You'll vaccinate doctors and nurses. What about the cleaning staff, the cafeteria workers, the other support personnel in health facilities? Are they also at the top of the list? How about teachers? Are they at the top of the list so that kids can get back to school and parents can get back to work? Do you vaccinate older people first because they're more at risk, even though the science indicates that vaccines might not be as effective in older populations, and maybe it's better to vaccinate the younger people for whom the vaccine is more effective, and then you prevent the younger people from transmitting the virus to older people. So governments have a lot to do in terms of good science, rigorous and open communication campaigns, and prioritization and planning before the vaccines become available.
Wow, I mean, this picture, Judith and Patrick, is quite sobering, and you just touched upon some relevant issues. But I would like to go back to Patrick when he talked about, in general, about the COVAX and the list of our countries which are eligible and some countries which are not. Patrick, so what is the mechanism through which countries can talk about financing part? How do they access finance for vaccine from this facility, from COVAX? Can you please elaborate on that?
So the GDP level, the cutoff is for any country that has a GDP below $4,000, they qualify to be part of the subsidized COVAX facility. So they're automatically included in the 92 countries. Any country that's above that is not included, but they can express right now, before the end of August, they have to write a letter to the COVAX or to Gavi that they're interested in being part of the advanced market commitment. Basically, what it means is that they're expressing interest as a country that they want to be one of the countries in the pool that will be considered when a vaccine is made available, and then they will contribute some money towards that effort. Basically, the money within COVAX is to finance trials for various vaccines. And if any of them succeeds, any of the countries on the list, whether they're self-financing or they're subsidized, will benefit from that. So there's a deadline coming up at the end of August to submit an expression of interest to be part of that advanced market commitment. After that, if you have not expressed an interest, if a vaccine is found and you're not part of this, you'll not benefit. But I want just to caution that COVAX is not the only option. There are many other companies that are doing clinical trials of vaccines that are not part of COVAX. Some big companies, and those may have to cut their own deals. Some countries might want to cut their own deals with those companies. For example, if say Pfizer is not part of that, or Johnson & Johnson is not part of COVAX, or they only contribute a small proportion of whatever vaccine is to COVAX, then any country can deal directly with the manufacturer. The challenge is there'll be competition. Some countries might get because they are willing to pay slightly higher price and they're willing to have a higher dose compared to other countries. So that's where the challenge will be, competition, and you cannot guarantee that you'll get it. But of course, there's also the opportunity that you might put your money in COVAX and none of the vaccines succeeds, and then you still have to go to the market to get vaccines and so on. So there's still a lot of issues that we need to think about. But I just want to show slide number 5, please, if you don't mind.
Sure. Iyo? I think there is a bit of a delay on screen sharing.
Yeah, so number 5.
Yeah, this one.
The next one. Next one. Okay, so as we think about vaccines, so we've talked about COVAX, which is how do you obtain the vaccine? That, of course, is a lot of conversation at the global level and so on. But what countries should spend more time thinking about is how this vaccine is going to be delivered. Because this is a complex situation. You might actually have a vaccine in your country, then you're stuck. You don't know how to go about it. Because what you need to have in place is a very clear strategy of how you're going to distribute this vaccine. Because countries will not have all the vaccines they need on day one. They will only have a small fraction of vaccines. So there has to be a very clear strategy. Who's going to get it first? Is it going to be the whole country if it's, say, for example, health workers, or is it going to be the capital city only? If it's the elderly population are very difficult to reach sometimes because they are elderly, they don't go to the clinics. How are you going to reach them? If it's how much will it cost to be able to do this? What kind of supply chain should you have in place? Are you going to use the existing supply chain for routine immunization? Now, the challenge is in many countries, in the former Soviet Republic, the routine immunization works quite well. And then the challenges, of course, you see in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, if you already have issues and challenges in the traditional vaccine delivery, are you going to use that same delivery or a separate delivery because now you're focusing on adults? The routine vaccine delivery is for children. Now, this one is for adults and the elderly. Are you going to use a separate one? So there are many, many things to think about. And how are you going to finance all these issues? So that's the second level. So the COVAX is just one level. This, the delivery at the country level is extremely complicated, and we as ADB will be supporting our member countries to do that. Then the third thing is issues around regulation. Because, like it's been said before, this will be a new vaccine that the history is very limited. So how do you follow the in the market to see post-market surveillance to see how is it performing in the community and so on? How will that be done? Will that be done country by country, or would that be done at a regional level where there's more capacity? And within ADB, we're also thinking about technology transfer. If it is discovered by company X, a big company, but then they want to manufacture millions of dosages and so on, how can that technology be transferred to some of the manufacturing companies in our region, for example, in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, in Indonesia? These are countries that have expertise in manufacturing vaccines and so on. So as ADB, we can provide loans to private sector companies to be able to produce sufficient numbers of vaccines going forward. But this will not be immediate. This will be down the line. Over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Quite comprehensive, actually. The more you or Judy talk or answer our questions, the more questions appear in our mind. So maybe if I can change the direction a little bit, and maybe if I can ask Judy about sort of risks. You already touched on grave risk, very important challenges out there. But lately, there has been quite a bit of discussion about vaccine nationalism. And of course, the kind of recent experience with procurement of PPEs, personal protective equipment, is not all that encouraging in that respect. So what are some scenarios on how COVID vaccine distribution could go wrong? So in other words, what are the issues, what are the scenarios that our governments in our countries, but also general population, all us, we should be aware, and how we should anticipate and mitigate these forthcoming risks?
Thank you for that question. There's not an encouraging recent history on equitable distribution of pharmaceutical products around the world. We look back to HIV, for example. Antiretroviral cocktails became available back in the mid-1990s. In 1996, but it took 7 years for those life-saving medications to be widely distributed across Africa, which was the area hardest hit by HIV. Similarly, in 2009 with H1N1, the United States and many European countries donated 10% of their vaccine stocks to poor countries, but that was only after they'd clearly satisfied all of their own population's needs. And of course, you mentioned the recent experience early in the COVID-19 pandemic with acquisition of personal protective equipment. I mean, actors at all levels, national governments, regional governments, individual health facilities, private sector actors, civil society actors, all were negotiating separately with China and some other suppliers, Turkey, in order to try to desperately get those pieces of equipment that they needed for their populations. If we look at what the United States is doing right now with its Operation Warp Speed, that's more than $6 billion that the United States is paying to several vaccine manufacturers to reserve doses of vaccine exclusively for the United States population. In Europe, the Inclusive Vaccine Alliance, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, they've signed a deal to buy 400 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine for use just in European Union member states. The United Kingdom also has that kind of deal with AstraZeneca. China has quite a few lines of vaccine development in progress. It's not known how early they'll be willing to share whatever they develop if it's successful, or whether any sharing from China would come with political strings attached. Brazil, China, India all have very large vaccine manufacturing capabilities, but they all have large populations, and so they might reserve their supplies for their own citizens before they start to open up to citizens of other countries. It's reasonable to ask how much geopolitics will be a factor in all of this. Will countries share vaccine with their allies and with their friends and perhaps withhold vaccine from others? Will there be resentment against countries that have hoarded vaccines for themselves that might prevent future international cooperation down the line? And will countries start to get into procurement wars? Will they use whatever leverage they have to try to negotiate in the harshest of terms to get vaccine supplies for their own people? There are many countries that have a disproportionate share of the supply of critical vaccine components, raw ingredients, syringes, the medical glass that you need to make glass vials. Modern supply chains are global and complex, and there are many interlocking and moving parts in this web, nodes along which countries can try to exert leverage or retaliation against one another. All of this increases also the risk for black markets for vaccines and treatments, and the risk of a rise in the supply of substandard medications or counterfeit medications. So those are things that countries need to be aware of. There are a couple of other negative scenarios down the line. One is a danger that countries or societies, once a vaccine is developed and released, will think, oh, we have a vaccine, and therefore we can start to decelerate or stop our work on all of the other tools that we need to employ against COVID-19, treatment, testing, contact tracing. All of those things will still be important for defeating the virus. So in the long run, all of those other things will remain as important as a vaccine, and we need not to downplay those as we move forward with vaccine release and distribution. And then finally, there's the point that ramping up COVID vaccination will place additional stress on health systems that are already at their breaking point in many parts of the world. Routine immunization programs have been disrupted. In Russia, HIV clinics have been repurposed for coronavirus testing. This is very common, the interruption or the displacement of existing services in order to meet the needs of this specific pandemic. So we need to pay attention to supply chains, cold chain equipment, trained healthcare workers, data systems, disease surveillance efforts, all of those fundamental building blocks of health systems that are already under strain. Those elements of existing programs will have to be fortified, strengthened, because they'll be the backbone of the delivery mechanism for eventual COVID vaccine.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you. Thank you. Very informative. Patrick, maybe if I go back to you, and because we touched upon many issues now, and we are actually getting a lot of questions. And thank you very much to our viewers for very good, intelligent question. And I think I will ask now Patrick, and then after this question, we can move to Q&A session, Nargis, if it's okay with you. Patrick, so let's say we have, let's just be optimistic and hopeful, and let's say that we have successful, safe vaccine developed. So what is it that our countries do or expect to do to prepare for vaccines, for the stage when the vaccine will be available to population, which we understand from your talk and from Judy's is not going to happen in a short period of time, but let's hope it will happen. So how do countries prepare for availability of vaccine? Yeah, Patrick.
The vaccine will be available at some stage in the near future. And the countries should not wait until the vaccine is available to start preparing. They should start preparing now. And what that means is that they should start having a dialogue that when the vaccine is available, what process do we go through to ensure that the right people get the vaccine. And so what's needed, and within ADB, what we are doing is that we are working with partners. We're working with one partner in the US called PATH, that will begin the process of engaging with the countries and come up with a template of what kind of a strategy you need to be able to start the preparation process. So as ADB, we are here to support our member countries to engage in a discussion how they should get ready. Countries will start at different stages. Some countries are more prepared than others. Some countries have very strong immunization programs. Some countries have very strong leadership in terms of the way that they are managing the current immunization programs. Some countries are still struggling with the current immunization programs and so on. So countries will will start at different stages. So the first stage is facilitation. How do you facilitate and bring everybody together, the various stakeholders that are part of this process, to ensure that you have a very clear plan, a very clear strategy of what you are going to do. These should be done all in advance, similar to what they do in any disaster. Usually for any disaster, before a disaster strikes, whether it's a hurricane, typhoon or so, there's already a plan of what would happen if there's a typhoon, what would happen if there's going to be a hurricane. So this is the kind of planning that countries should start now. And we are here to help countries to develop the strategy, to come up with the implementation plan, to come up with a financing plan, and if they need to think about how they'll get money to be able to respond, we are a development bank. This is how we support countries and so on. So we can start the process of ensuring that if they need money, they can have the money to be able to purchase the vaccine, and at the same time to be able to deliver the vaccine.
Thank you, Patrick. Nargis, shall we move to question and answers session?
Mm-hmm. Let's do that. Well, we have received a bunch of very good questions. Thank you very much for them. I'm afraid we will not be able to answer all of them, but let me assure you that we will keep them, and we will consider them in shaping our future events. And well, let me start the first round of questions. Let's see how many rounds we will do. Hopefully a couple we can fit. And I want to start with the questions to Judy. I will ask several questions, and then Judy, you can answer. You can sequence the way you see fit. One question was sort of a global level question. Is it a problem that there will be different types of vaccines around the world? Does it affect collective immunity? And we also received a number of questions, sort of more regional level. Should we rush to get priority access to Russian vaccine, especially given that they seem to be cutting some corners in the development of these vaccines, right? It's already two. And also, given this shortage of trust in the governments in our region, what would you recommend governments to do to kind of have successful vaccination campaigns, or preparation for vaccination also campaigns? Are there any, well, probably I shouldn't call it tricks, but are there any special strategies you would recommend to the governments? And also a question regarding the fair distribution: how can we make sure that these are essential groups that will get the vaccination first? So basically the selected groups, that what we have on paper, will be actually implemented on the ground, rather than elites getting access first. Thank you.
Wow, those are great questions. Thanks to everyone who posed them. So I'll just try to take them in order. First of all, on the question about the impact on collective immunity of different vaccines around the world, it will be the case that there will be different vaccines released in different locations around the world. Those vaccines will have varying levels of effectiveness. There will be some places where herd immunity, we hope, is achieved. There will probably be places where herd immunity is not achieved right away, and maybe not for a fairly lengthy period of time. And so this goes back to a point I made earlier, that it will be very important to monitor what's happening, communicate effectively what has been achieved in terms of immunity, and make sure that we're not dropping the ball on mask wearing and physical distancing and all of the other measures that will have to be continued in parallel with the release of a vaccine in order to protect populations and be able to open our societies back up again. In terms of the rushing for access to a Russia-produced vaccine, my advice would be to follow the guidelines of the World Health Organization, and to follow the established benchmarks and regulatory procedures that are approved by those international technical governing bodies. In terms of how to build trust among populations, and with all the questions and all the disinformation and what inevitably is already out there and will be out there on social media about vaccines, how do you communicate effectively with populations in order to ensure that the rollout happens as smoothly as possible? I'd say, again, work together with partner countries in the region, work together with ADB, with World Bank, with WHO, work together with UNICEF and UNDP, some of the institutions that have the very important specific experience with communication campaigns around vaccine hesitancy and vaccine refusal, and be open. Reach out to as many people, as many groups of stakeholders, as many elements of society as you can. Patrick said, start the planning now. Don't plan behind closed doors in government. Do that planning in open forums with as much input from as broad a range of stakeholders as you can. Get people on board to the decisions that you're making very early in the process, so that as many people as possible feel as though they are invested in the decisions that have been made and the successful outcomes of those decisions.
Thank you very much. Let me give a round of questions to Patrick now. You already mentioned several initiatives that ADB is supporting and what ADB plans, but can you maybe elaborate on that, what the ADB is doing to prepare successful vaccination, and what it is planning to do? Also, there is a question about the middle-income countries. What do you think middle-income countries can and should do? And as you mentioned in your presentation, some middle-income countries, such as Kazakhstan, for example, Armenia, they pull out from the COVAX initiative. So what can they do individually and maybe collectively? And there was also a question about the pricing range. What do you think will be the pricing range of vaccines?
Okay, so ADB as a development bank, we provide knowledge, and this is an example of knowledge that we provide at the regional level. We can also provide knowledge at the country level, so that people are aware about the benefits and any challenges and risks that you might run into. The second offer that we provide is technical assistance. We can support countries working very closely with the National Immunization Program, the Ministry of Health, the various ministries that are involved in this process to engage on some of the issues that Judy was talking about in a very transparent way. If 90% of those who die from COVID are the elderly, people above the age of 65, and the people with pre-existing conditions like diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and so on. And this message is communicated very effectively to the population that these are the people that will get the vaccine first. I think that, and that because they're the highest risk, I'm guessing that in many societies, people say, that's okay, let them get the vaccine first, and so on. So it has to be something that is very transparent, very open, a very effective communication. People are educated, and they know that what is being done is actually the right thing to do. Those elderly people are the pre-existing conditions, are their parents, their grandmothers, their grandfathers, and so on. These are not some utopian people that exist from somewhere else. These are people they live with in the household, and they want to protect the same people that they love, and so on. So I think that as ADB, we can provide technical assistance in a variety of areas, in the planning process, the communication process, in the delivery process. We can provide financing to establish the supply chain system, but it has to be done, and the ADB process is not instant. You don't come to ADB and you say you want money tomorrow. It does not work like that. So you have to go through a process of, we work collaboratively with you. We cost what is it that you need as a country, and then you start the process of negotiating how the money will be transferred to you as a country, be sure that you're ready and you deliver the vaccine. My biggest fear, and we saw this in HIV with antiretroviral, many countries were not able to test the people who needed the disease to be able to detect whether they were infected or not. Second, many countries who were able to test, they were not able to do the viral load that was required, because if you put someone on treatment, you needed them to be able to take medication, and then you test whether that medicine is working or not, or whether they've developed resistance against the antiretroviral and so on. They didn't have that because they never invested in the laboratories that was required in advance. They waited until at the last minute, and they were saying, we want to establish a treatment program with no infrastructure in place to be able to deliver this. So this is why it is very important that it's not just a matter of having vaccines in the country. You have to be ready to ensure that everything is done properly. The second question that you asked is about price. It's very difficult to determine the price right now, because just going to what Judy was also saying, we need many companies to be producing vaccine. We cannot rely on one company in the world producing vaccine for everybody. That would be a very dangerous situation to be in. So we need many vaccines produced by many companies, and then the technology is transferred so that our countries, Kazakhstan, has the capacity to produce vaccines. There are companies licensed in Kazakhstan to produce vaccines. Pakistan is able to produce vaccines and so on. And so it's licensed to produce vaccines so that there are many sources of vaccines. People have options to buy vaccines, and therefore the price will be dependent on how many vaccines are out there in the market, how many companies have been able to transfer the technology, and there might also even be differential pricing whereby some poor countries get it at a slightly lower price compared to some of the high-income countries. Over to you.
Actually, Patrick, can I ask you here, just following on this question, on your response, and also we received one question here in the chat box, that instead of distributing vaccines in countries, why don't we just provide technology for producing these vaccines to developing countries and let them produce? And you just mentioned on that. But we also heard, and we see in literature news, that production of a vaccine is an incredibly complex process. It's more complicated than production of these molecular-based medicines and so on. So can you please comment on that? Why this approach is not really appropriate, probably mainly to distribute technology to developing countries instead of vaccine itself?
So one time I had a conversation with GlaxoSmithKline asking, why don't you transfer the technology very quickly whenever you get a vaccine? They said the entire platform to produce vaccines is between $15 to $20 billion to establish. And it takes a while to do that. So not every company can do it. That's why countries like Serum Institute in India that has been producing vaccines, they have the infrastructure to do that. That's why some of the countries already have the infrastructure to do that. So it's not something that Armenia can just decide that, okay, we want to produce vaccine today. No, it is not possible. So it's a very complex, expensive, technology-driven, that require very highly experienced staff that is something that's been built over time and so on. And if you want the COVID vaccine to be reproduced quickly, you have to go to established companies in some of our member states to be able to do this. So if India can do it, then let India produce it, because India is actually producing almost, in some vaccines, almost 70% for the global supply of some of those vaccines and so on. So why not just go to a company like that? What they need is just expanding what they have. The technology is already there. They just expand what they have, and that's produced. So it will not be just, say, Russian companies or European companies or American companies, but companies that are actually middle-income countries that are developing member countries, because labor is cheaper, it will be easier and cheaper. Those vaccines will be much cheaper compared to vaccines that are being produced in some high-income countries and so on. So yes, I think the biggest solution to this problem will be technology transfer to companies in the developing countries that already have the technology to produce vaccines.
Thank you, Patrick. Nargis, if it's okay, there is one question that came to my private chat box.
Yes.
So will it be acceptable, is there a requirement, and what is the requirements of this letter on advance commitments, and have all these requirements on advance commitments to COVAX been communicated to the governments already? I don't know if you know the details of this process. If so, Patrick or Judy, maybe you can comment on that.
I'll just comment that for COVAX, almost all the documents are online or on the website. So if you go there, all the countries that qualify, the countries that don't qualify, the process it will take, and so it's all online. You can get it on the Gavi website.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Maybe we can ask 2 more questions, Liz. I think we are,
sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
we are on time. So there was a question for Judy. Judy, could you give specific examples of substandards that Russia is introducing by formalizing the approval of Russian vaccine for COVID-19? And also there was a good question about politicization of the vaccine. How can we avoid or minimize that? And that's the question for Judy, and maybe Patrick also can comment on that.
So we don't have a lot of public information about exactly what Russia is doing as it makes these statements about moving forward with mass vaccination of first military personnel and now healthcare workers and teachers. But it appears as though they're either dramatically compressing what would normally be the phase 3 of clinical trials, or they're basically doing this mass vaccination of these population groups as their phase 3 of clinical trials. But normally phase 3 is a very controlled process involving between 20,000 and 100,000 test subjects who are very carefully selected. They're selected so that they cover a representative range of age groups, health conditions, race and ethnicity, geographic location, and then they're controlled with those who actually get the vaccine and those who get a placebo. They're followed very closely. And the reason that you want to have this very close monitoring of a large group of test subjects is because many times the side effects, the adverse effects after a vaccine occur among a very small percentage of the population. So you need a large N in order to pick up whatever those adverse effects are going to be. You just don't get that in your phase 1 and phase 2 rounds that might only cover a few hundred people. So if we want the good data that we need on what the likely adverse effects are, and also the good data on longer term efficacy issues, we need rigorous phase 3 clinical trials. And it's not at all clear that that's the kind of structure that Russia is following as it moves forward so quickly.
Just on that politicization of vaccines, this is of course going to be a big issue because we saw it during PPEs where there was diplomacy, PPE diplomacy. Countries that were allies, for example, to China were able to get PPEs and others that were not allies did not get it that easily. And we're beginning to see this also in vaccines. Case in point, the Philippines, the president of the Philippines said he would like the Philippines to be the first country to get the vaccine from China. And a week later, the Chinese embassy made an announcement that Philippines will be the first country to get the vaccine. So you don't know what kind of politics was being played there, but of course we expect that some countries that are producing a vaccine might give them to their allies first before it's given to some other people.
Well, we have a similar dynamic around the Russian vaccine now. Yeah, with allies, trying to get the priority access and promise the priority access to the vaccine. Yeah, so there will be a lot to watch, I guess, in the near future. And how can we avoid that? Can we minimize that?
I think through COVAX, that's COVAX one way of minimizing that. But when it comes to national interest and diplomacy and countries that are allies to each other, it's very difficult to minimize that effort.
There's been a lot of conversation about the need for some of the more powerful, influential international bodies to step up and take the reins in this situation. The G20, the UN, more broadly, and that's a wonderful recommendation in principle, but it's very challenging to see how that would play out in reality when some of the most powerful players in those international organizations like the United States and China appear to be going into this with a more self-interested stance.
Yeah, multilateralism is definitely under stress, and it's not a good time for it, obviously. Well, one very practical question that we got several times: if you had COVID already, for how long are you immune, and do you need to get vaccinated?
Judy, you want to take that?
So there are lots of questions about how long natural immunity following having been infected lasts. That's just one of many unanswered questions about COVID. COVID is throwing new curveballs at us all the time. There are so many things that we don't understand about this virus and about how it impacts people. So we don't know how long you're protected if you have already had COVID. And so probably getting a vaccine is a good idea. And we also think we understand that the time period of natural immunity after having had the virus, any virus, kind of puts a ceiling on how long the immunity from a vaccine can be. So we're going to have to let the months and years play out before we have definitive answers to that question.
So we've had this virus for only 4 months. So if you have to look at immunity on those that were infected, it's only 4 months since they recovered and so on for the first cohort of those who are infected. And so there isn't enough time. But if you look at the previous coronavirus, the SARS, in 2003, most immunity waned after 1 year. The maximum took about 2 years. This, of course, this is a different coronavirus. It's behaving differently compared to SARS. But so far, in a few cases that have been followed, they're still waning. Even within 2 months, beginning to see that immunity is going down. So we don't know.
Well, if you allow me to be a little bit provocative here, and let's say a vaccine is available from a reputable company, WHO approved, and the analysis or opinions of professional people says that this vaccine will provide you immunity for 3 to 4 months, as Patrick just said. Will you guys be vaccinated yourself?
So I think the question that you're asking is that if you take the person that is infected and that the mean immune level, the maximum immune level, is for the people who are infected. Now that any vaccine that's being produced will be that maximum or below. But then the science now is showing that the kind of vaccine that they're trying to produce should be 3 to 4 times stronger than the immunity that's being generated with someone who is infected. But this you still don't know, because it's new technology vaccine that's being used that has never been used before. Some platforms that have never been used before. And they, of course, the manufacturers are saying this will be 5 times better, stronger immunity compared to immunity after infection. But we don't know. I think that the question you're asking is, if everybody's talking about this vaccine, and that this vaccine will be administered to many people, and that it has to be done every 4 months or every 6 months or every year, is this something that we can really afford? And so on. We already have challenges with the flu vaccines. So the flu vaccine is taken every year, but only in many places, in very developed countries, only 40% of the people actually take the flu vaccine every year.
Okay, I think, Patrick, you made my question a bit more intelligent than it was. My question was simpler. Will you go for the first vaccination in the first phase yourself?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we can squeeze one more question. What are the basic ingredients of COVID-19 vaccines? Is there a danger of shortage of those? Who wants to take it?
Judy, you.
So as Patrick just indicated, we're in uncharted territory with a lot of the different types of vaccines that are being developed. There are many different diverse platforms that are being tried with the different product lines that are under development. So there are so many different ingredients, and yes, there is risk of shortages, hoarding of many of those. It'll be surprising if that doesn't turn out to be a factor in production and distribution as we move forward.
I think you guys both touched upon it and maybe already mentioned, but let me just still ask this question. So with this massive vaccination, hopefully massive vaccination that the world will afford and able to do, what kind of percentage of population should be vaccinated in order to reach herd immunity?
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. Judy, do you?
I don't think we know enough about COVID yet to have a definitive answer to that question.
Yeah, lots of questions unanswered. Nargis, do we have more questions, or shall we, because the time is already getting to
I think
close?
we'd better move to the next round because we're exactly hitting the mark.
Yeah, I think we are getting, but basically the next round is the closing round already. Before asking the last question to our experts, I would like also to mention to our audience, there was one question about translation into Russian. Of course, a lot of countries that are watching our seminar, our knowledge sharing event, may want to have Russian translation. So let me just tell you that we will have this recording. We will make it translated into Russian language, and we will make it available. So we have all the emails of those who registered, and we will make it available. I think, Patrick, during the round on ADB assistance and ADB activities on this COVID vaccine to our developing member countries, including Central and West Asian countries, you did mention earlier to us that there is some tool, some kind of a dashboard that ADB developed or is developing now, which is accessible, which will be accessible to general public, not just to ADB staff. So would you like now to show this dashboard, maybe to demonstrate it? We have a few minutes, so it will be possible.
Yeah, so the biggest challenge that we faced as we've been implementing COVID is to get one source of data that shows you the number of confirmed cases, the number of deaths, the economic impact that it has. If you want to know what are the government measures, the countries that are under restrictions and so on, you have to go to multiple websites. So we engaged a company called Click, is one of the 3 top companies in the world that does data visualization to be able to help us pull all the data, economic data, public health measures data, and so on, so that with one click of a button, you can get all the information. The final data, the final dashboard will be available next week, but we just wanted to show everybody today and to let them know that it's going to come up. So Michael, are you connected?
Yes, I am. Thanks.
Okay.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, please. I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great. So first of all, thank you to Patrick and Judy for the really insightful comments, and thank you for the entire team for organizing such a great session. As Patrick mentioned, I'm sure that everyone is familiar with the large number of dashboards that currently exist on COVID-19, but we identified a few gaps in these existing dashboards. So mainly that they only show one side of the pandemic, only the number of cases, and not going into economic impacts to government responses and things like pandemic preparedness before COVID-19, and then also that they weren't flexible and didn't allow for exploration. So as Patrick mentioned, we've been working very closely with Click to solve these problems. And so here's just a quick demonstration of the capacities of this site, and hopefully my internet will work.
While it is loading, Michael, let me just reiterate. I think this tool will be available and accessible to anyone who would like to access it. You don't have to be ADB staff to do that. Somehow we probably will need to provide a link, or maybe it will be available on adb.org.
Yes.
Yes, we'll do both of those things when and this is still the prototype, so that's why there are some lags. Mm-hmm. But just to demonstrate, so here we have the entire global situation. You can see the total confirmed cases in the top left, today's cases, total deaths, and then today's deaths. But if we wanted to filter by the countries in our regional department, we can zoom in on the countries in the Central West region, and we can see that overall Pakistan has the greatest number of confirmed cases since January 1st. But we would want to also be able to see what is happening more recently. And so that's one of the features that our dashboard adds. We can see here that since July 1st, if we scroll down, we can see that actually since July 1st, Kazakhstan has had more cases per day than Pakistan. And so that country is actually driving the outbreak more recently in the region. And this is the kind of time-based disaggregation that we haven't seen yet in other dashboards. And so if we actually wanted to look at what countries in the Central West region are doing and the government measures that they're taking, we can also look at that individually. This graph on the right here shows the number of government measures taken and the types of government measures taken, graphed along with the number of cases, confirmed cases over time. So these are broadly movement restrictions, like border closures, social economic policies like stimulus packages, and public health policies and social distancing policies. So if we wanted, for example, to see when various countries went on full lockdown, we can filter by that and see, okay, so Kazakhstan went on full lockdown on March 19th and when other countries are instilling these lockdowns. Similarly, we can look at things like school closures and really a whole number of other government measures. This is just a very brief presentation. We also have things like economic measures, GDP losses based on ADB projections, and joint external evaluation, pandemic preparedness and response capacities as collected by the World Health Organization. And we can also compare different countries. So we will be happy to share this platform with everyone once the final version is ready, and that should happen in the next week or so.
Very
so thank
good.
you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Patrick. We will all wait for this tool. It looks like a very informative and useful tool for analysts, think tanks, definitely governments. With this, let me also say that a lot of people within ADB, within very different departments of ADB. By the way, Patrick is from a department which is called Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department. Myself and some of my colleagues, we are from regional department. So a lot of people are working on not just assistance, operational assistance, lending, investments, loans and grants, but also on the analytical part of this. And if I can have a little bit of advertisement maybe here, many people in our region know about CAREC program, Central Asian Regional Economic Cooperation Program. Under that, we have a CAREC Institute. It's a knowledge arm of the CAREC program. And quite a few people within CAREC Institute are now engaging in some studies on COVID impacts for the CAREC region. And CAREC region covers all of our Central Asian and West Asian countries except for Armenia, plus also PRC, China, and Mongolia also part of this program. So quite a few analytical pieces are coming already. Also, we are looking at the impact of COVID on tourism in the Central Asia region, in the CAREC region, and also impact of COVID-19 on micro and SMEs in the region. So these things will be coming at some point, we hope this year. And this, of course, will be all available publicly. I think with this, let me go to the closing stage. I think we have just a few minutes left, and we would like to thank, well, first of all, of course, Patrick and Judy for a lot of insights and a lot of knowledge that you did transfer today to us. And that was precisely the whole point of this knowledge sharing session. We hope we will have more of these events in future related to vaccines, but also related, as I said at the beginning, to other COVID-related challenges that we have. So just before closing, let me also ask the audience to please send us your suggestions for some topics or ideas that you would like to raise and you would like to have. We are always open. We are Asian Development Bank working for our countries. We would like to listen to your thoughts on this. But in closing, I'd like still to ask one last question to Judy and Patrick, to pose this question to you. If you just imagine that you are advising right now prime ministers of our countries, Central and West Asian countries, can you, for your closing remarks, and based on what we have discussed overall during this 1.5 hours, can you tell us what should be on the to-do list of these governments?
Judy, can I go first?
In the context of preparing for the vaccine.
I'll go first. So there are so many things that go on this to-do list, but I will focus on 5 that have emerged from our conversation today. First, as Patrick has already said, is to start thinking now about how vaccine will be distributed when it becomes available. Think about priorities for access, explain the logic behind those priorities very carefully to people, and involve a wide range of stakeholders in that decision making. Second, think in advance about logistics, about warehousing, transportation space. Air freight capacity has been hit very hard during this pandemic because of the grounding of passenger planes, and those passenger planes also carry goods. So start thinking about planning for air capacity, ground handling personnel, refrigerated containers, handling procedures, contingency plans. You know, if there's a storm, if trucks get delayed, if planes get delayed, what are the plans in place to get the vaccine product back into cold storage? Think about all those things logistically in advance. Third, as I've already mentioned, work on communication strategies. People tend to trust their personal medical providers, their own doctors, so use the voices of those doctors. Identify in advance communities where you know there's prevalent vaccine skepticism and tailor your outreach toward those specific communities. Monitor social media, use it as a tool against vaccine hesitance, and use non-traditional messengers to speak the news about the availability and the safety of the vaccine. So use celebrities, use religious leaders, use sporting and entertainment figures, other influencers, and be prepared for the adverse effects related to vaccines and communicate directly and honestly and quickly with people about those things to maintain trust. Fourth, work together. In this environment of what's probably going to be intense vaccine nationalism, there's a joint negotiating power of groups of countries working together that might elevate those voices more than that of any single country. Align regulatory requirements, develop mutual recognition practices between regulators. All of those things will save resources and time and avoid redundancy. And then finally, to end on a positive note, you know, it's a cliche that we hear all the time now, that this is a moment to turn crisis into opportunity or to build back better. But there really are ways to do that. Take advantage of the capacity that's being developed on the fly right now because of the restrictions that are in place with the pandemic for things like telemedicine, engagement of community health workers and mobile health teams, distribution of essential drugs to patients in longer supply so that people don't have to visit health facilities during lockdown. You know, there are lots of places that are giving 6 months worth of HIV, TB, hepatitis, non-communicable disease meds to patients. Think about extending that kind of strategy indefinitely. Use of telephone hotlines, especially for mental illness. There are all of these important innovations, all of which apply to vaccine development and distribution, and all of which apply to strengthening health systems in the longer term. So it's very possible to turn this crisis into a positive moment, into an opportunity for the long haul.
Thank you. Patrick?
Thank you. So my advice to the Prime Minister would be, Mr. Prime Minister, there's a lot going on in terms of vaccines. You should be engaged in the dialogue that's going on. For example, to have a representative who is actually engaged in the conversation around how to obtain the vaccine. They should engage with COVAX to understand whether they are going to receive the vaccine either subsidized or self-financing. They need to be around the table when this conversation is going on, because the last thing you want is whereby the cake is being cut and you're not there. So first, ensure that you are around the table. Even if you're not ready to make a commitment to COVAX, at least engage in the conversation around COVAX and so on. Then you have to think about how you're going to finance the vaccine, the supply of the vaccine. How will you? Is that financing that has domestic financing that has to be allocated by the Ministry of Finance, and then discuss in Parliament and so on? If that's the case, you should start those conversations right now so that you have the funding ready. Either you're part of the COVAX, or if you decide to go directly to any of the manufacturers, you have the financing ready. you also have to think about regulation. How are you going to regulate this thing? How are you going to register the vaccine in the country? Either would that be done within your own country, or if it's through the CAREC entity or sub-regional entity and so on, should there be experts from the sub-regional level that discuss and agree that because of perhaps limited capacity in some of the countries, that will be done through a central coordinated sub-regional effort, whereby you have experts reviewing the vaccine that is out, looking at all the data that has been presented. If it's a vaccine from Russia, is all the data regarding the safety, is it all available? And the experts in the Central West have looked at it and say, this is a good vaccine and so on. Make it as transparent as possible. In some of the countries that can manufacture vaccine, like for example, Pakistan or Kazakhstan, is there a way by which the Prime Minister can start engaging with some of the countries or some of the companies that we are hearing that are producing the good vaccines and so on, and saying that, or is there a way by which the state can say, can we support our companies so that in the event that the vaccine is available, they can actually produce for the region? That's something that the Prime Minister should think about if you come from some of the bigger countries. And then in terms of delivering, is thinking about the planning. In many countries that have failed in terms of managing the COVID pandemic right now, is because there's no clear plan from the center that is supporting the centralized structures and so on. The Prime Minister work with your cabinet and everyone across all sectors to ensure that you have a very good plan and how you're going to strengthen your system. And system here is not just the health system, the private sector, the public sector, the civil society organization, because this will be a massive undertaking. Just the public sector alone cannot be able to do this. And how are you going to finance this delivery? And just to underscore what Judy talked about, communication is going to be key, because there'll be many, many people that will come out against this vaccine. They'll say, it was done very rapidly. The science was not enough. My child took this thing. My child almost died. There has to be a system of communicating the verification of every case that comes out and saying, this is a normal adverse effect of vaccine. The child was sick, developed fever, because this is, some of the vaccines are more or less the same virus, but a less virulent virus and so on. They'll create some symptoms or mild symptoms. That is normal. So people should not panic, but then they should rely on what the experts are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both, Judith and Patrick. It's been very, I hope, informative session. Judging from the comments we are getting here, it's been very insightful. I think one actually suggestion I see from one of our audience person here is on the importance of data. And I think this whole COVID situation show how important it is to have a proper data management and access to a good data. So this dashboard, I think, would be also very, very useful. And somebody is asking for update in 2 months, so we should think about it as well. Also, Patrick, in your closing remarks, you just also mentioned about the need for cooperation, for regional coordination and cooperation. And I know that in one of your previous reincarnations and previous work, you've been instrumental in building up African CDC, sort of. So we discussed this a little bit with you, whether such a CDC type of organization would be useful to have in CAREC countries or in Central Asian countries. So this is perhaps for thinking for the future. I also have to say that ADB management recently approved a regional technical assistance on health support to our countries in our region, in our department. So we all hope that this will be a very good and useful technical assistance. So with all this, we are a little bit behind already. We were supposed to finish at 8:30, but the subject was very interesting. And I think the discussion was very good. So I would like to really very sincerely thank Patrick and Judy for everything that you gave to us, all this information and experience that you have. I also would like to thank Nargis, my partner in crime, for this first knowledge sharing session. Very, very much appreciating your help, Nargis. and also in moderating this session. And I would like also to thank our team on ADB side. They're not here on the screen, but if you allow me just to tell you their names, it's Ari, Hani, Iyo, and also Michael. There were also quite a few other people who contributed to this session. So we would like to thank everybody, but most of all, I would like to thank our audience. You've been very good. You've been asking a lot of very good, intelligent questions and help making this discussion more interesting. So thank you very much for that. Please stay tuned. We will be coming up with more events of this sort, and we do hope they will be useful. Thank you very much, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon to wherever you are.